Hey there, this is Will Marshall at Pyramind in San Francisco. Today I'm going to be showing you the basics of using bus compression to help gel your drum sounds, particularly your electronically produced drum sounds together, to give them more groove and more kind of dynamism and more of a live feel. Now, bus compression is very simple, fundamentally. It's the act of putting a compressor on a group or a bus. So in this project here that I've created, just based on a drum loop from an old track of mine, you can see I have just rendered audio samples of all the different drums in the loop, and they're all going through this one drum group here, which has FabFilter Satin, just adding a little bit of distortion stuff, and then we'll be doing some compression. And that sounds like this. Now, the fundamental problem with electronically produced drum sounds like this is it's very, very hard to get all the dynamics of the hi-hats and the kicks and the snares all kind of flowing together. Like a real drummer naturally plays in the very organic way, with the volumes of all the parts kind of flowing gracefully in small, subtle ways that ties everything together. And when you're doing electronic music, you can do this to an extent, you know, with velocity modulation, just kind of writing very carefully to try and recreate that sound. But there are processing techniques, particularly bus compression, that can really help gel an entire group of drum sounds together. Basically, what we do is we use a compressor so that the volumes of all the drum sounds in the group kind of respond to each other. And the simplest or the most common way of doing this is putting compression on the entire drum bus, such that all the little detail stuff like any shakers or hi-hats, kind of smaller, quieter sounds, have a little bit of a pumping and a flow in their volume that's responsive to the louder sounds, in this case, and most often, the kick and the snare. So the way we do this is pretty simple. It's a very gentle compression, like we're only looking for a few dB. We don't want an extreme effect. You can play with that, but I tend to like this subtle rather than over the top. What we're gonna do is bring this threshold down such that the kick and the snare in particular of the drum loop are triggering the ducking. That's gonna be our first step, and then we'll improve it from there. I want to turn makeup gain off. An important little tip, when you're using the compressor in Ableton, just turn makeup gain off and then right click, save as default preset. Makeup gain is terrible, you should never use it, just leave it off forever. So right now this doesn't sound too good. The reason for that is the attack is quite short, and what it's doing is the compressor is kicking in on the snare and on the kick itself. Now for this kind of pumping effect, that's not what we want. We want to let the kind of initial transient of the kick and the snare through the compressor. I'm actually going to turn up the output of this compressor. No, I'm not. I'm going to use the utility plugin just so it's a little louder for you guys. What we want is to let the initial transient of the kick and the snare through, and then kind of duck the volume just after, and then have the volume come back up, ideally just in time for the next kick or snare to come in. There's a timing trick to it. So to let the initial attack of the kick or the snare through, we want to back off the attack slowly. Rule of thumb for me is around 40 to 100 milliseconds tends to be right, but rather than using a number, use your ears and just back this off until you feel like your kicks and your snares are sounding punchy in the way you want them to. So that nice slow attack is letting the kick and the snare come through and then clamping down on the compressor afterwards. Now the second thing we want to do is back off the release, because what we want is the compressor to clamp down after the kick and then kind of relax itself just in time for the next kick or the next snare to come in. So this is basically a matter of slowing down the release and using your ears until you feel that the compression you're using is grooving really nicely with the track. It's very subjective. With practice and time, you'll be better and better at slowing down this release until you feel like the pumping is in time with the music. Something to watch is you want to watch this gain reduction meter, and when it kind of clicks into place and the gain reduction is kind of pumping with the music, it will look right, it will feel right. It's a very intuitive thing, but it just clicks into place when you get it right. So There we go. So I'm putting it around 250 or so. Now, obviously, the slower the beat, the longer the release time, and the faster the beat, the shorter release time, because you want that pumping to be in time with the beat. And it doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, if it's a little imperfect, you know, if there's kind of a double kick or a double snare or something, and it ducks and it just kind of holds down for a little bit before coming up, that's good. That's giving you even more of a kind of organic, almost snaky flow to the gain reduction. Now, there's one fundamental problem that's going on here, and that's that the compressor, the gain reduction, is triggering a lot on the kick. And very little or not at all on the snare. The way I usually fix that quickly is use the EQ. You can actually EQ the input to the compressor and take some of the frequencies out. So in this case, we're going to use the high pass filter, this one here, which is the default. And we're going to roll off the very low end of the kick, which is obviously the loudest part of the kick, but the snare isn't down there. And what that effectively allows us to do is take kick out of the compression chain, so the effective volume of the kick and the snare are more even. Right now the kick's quite a lot louder than the snare. So we roll out those low frequencies until the compressor is responding to the kick and the snare kind of equally. And you just got to use your ears and your eyes looking at this gain reduction meter to get that right. And I'll probably have to bring the threshold down a little bit because it's responding to the kick but not really the snare at all. Now the gain reduction is pumping kind of much more evenly with the kicks and the snares and the claps. If I turn that EQ off, you can see how much more of the compressor is triggering with the kick. So that's another nice little tip, is often I use the EQ to just even it all out and give it more of a response to all of the loud elements in the drum sound rather than just the kick. The kick can be really overpowering and give you a kind of a cheesy, like housey sidechain sound, which is not nearly as nuanced and kind of intricate as a nice kind of little grooving flutter. All right, so now a really important thing here is to A/B what you've done. Now, with this kind of bus compression that we're looking at here, one of the challenges is it doesn't really tend to make the sound all that different, but it can make the groove different. So the way you want to listen to this is kind of almost move your body with the drum beat, and as I A/B the compressor on and off, feel into the groove of the drums rather than trying to hear some kind of tonal difference, because the tone of the drums is basically the same. So, off. On. Off. I gave it just a little bit of gain boost there because the overall effect of the compressor was to bring the overall volume down, just a little. So that is some basic bus compression. See that it's gentle and it's subtle, and it's all about giving you that kind of dynamic flow and beautiful movement. So, one last and final thing that I really like to do with this style of bus compression is to expand it out to sidechaining. Now, in this case, and this is something I personally do in my production a lot, is I often have a core drum pattern, which is kind of my kick and my snare and my primary drums, and I often have multiple different groups of kind of additional percussive layers, percussion, drum samples, things like that are more there for groove and are more kind of, you know, the lows are all rolled out of them, they're just kind of flowing along nicely. Now, there are two kind of ways we could approach that. You could route, you know, both the drums and in this case the percussion channel, which sounds like this, through a bus and then put the bus compression on all of that. It's kind of a pain in Ableton. This sort of thing's easier in Logic. I don't like to do that. What I often do is I copy the compressor, the bus compressor that's on the drums channel, and I move it over to the percussion channel. And then what I do is I turn on the sidechain and sidechain the percussion channel. Obviously, you could do this with lead sounds, pad sounds. You could do it with anything that you want to kind of groove more nicely with your core drum sound. So that now the volume of this percussion channel is responding to the volume of the drums, and it's using exactly the same compression settings. I might adjust them a little bit, but it's nice to start with the same compression settings so everything moves. What I'm going to do is put it to post effects and just do that. So now you can hear the effect of the drum compression on the percussion channel. So off, on. And I usually crank it just a little bit, might even just increase the ratio a little bit rather than turning down the threshold, just so the kind of secondary parts are compressing a little bit more. One last thing you can do is, because you're not, this compressor here is not on the drum bus itself, we don't have to worry about letting through the initial transients of the drum or the kick and the snare. We're not going to choke those off with this compressor, so we can bring down the attack. I don't like to overdo that, like bringing the attack down all the way, because then it makes when the compressor kicks, it flutters really fast and it feels like less organic, less natural. So I like that kind of slow movement, but a little bit faster and a little bit more movement on secondary things that are not the core drums. So again, A, B. So you can almost hear the actual underlying drum beat, even though it's muted, just listening to that secondary part. Now, what I'm going to do here is give you an A-B of all the things I've just done. I'm going to map this keyboard button here to this compressor and this compressor. This is a technique I use all the time, because now I can use one key press to turn both of these compressors off, and I can A-B the entire set of things I've just done in the mix to see how that sounds. So, off. And then on. It's a subtle difference, but I find that this kind of final bus compression layer can be the difference between a very sterile and very electronic sounding drum loop and something that just grooves and sounds amazing. And in particular with my production style, I often use this technique of a sidechain compressor with varying levels of intensity, like very subtle on some things, a little bit more on others, to provide just groove and movement to an entire track. Particularly, I do it a lot on my pad elements and some of my lead elements, just to give them a little bit of volume flutter in response to the drums. This is kind of an effect that you get naturally if you put things on tape. There's one loud sound on tape makes all the other sounds around it just slightly quieter for a moment. It's natural compression effect of tape. And in the electronic world, everything's digital, so everything's perfect and very clean. But if we want that kind of polished, organic sound, we actually have to make everything kind of flow with everything else. You don't overdo it, but little subtle things like this can make a huge difference to how organic and how living your music sounds. So that's the basics of bus compression. Obviously, you can go much, much deeper than this. You can use this sort of compression to get all sorts of different results. But this is, I think, the simplest example, and to me at least, is the most commonly used example. So thank you.